Welcome, everybody. My name is Fred Larson. I'm the president of the National Institute for Social Sciences. Welcome today to our discussion on what's next for democracy, the 2020 election. I think we're going to have a very interesting and informative and extremely timely discussion. We've got four great panelists who are going to be real experts in laying out the issues and challenges involved in the current election, and I hope you're all as excited about it as I am. I expect to learn a lot. First of all, some logistics. You are on mute by default. Only our panelists and moderator will speak during the session. If we do ask you to speak for any reason, we will be able to unmute your microphone. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which you're allowed to submit questions to the panelists. We'll be monitoring that during the course of the session. The panelists will see your questions as they come in. We'll probably reserve most of the questions to be answered near the end of the session, but they may, if they see something particularly timely, jump in and answer it while they're speaking. Finally, this forum is being recorded. We are going to share the link of the full edited version as soon after the event concludes, usually within 24 or 48 hours. So you can share the session, watch it again, or share it with colleagues. Moving on, this forum is sponsored by the National Institute of Social Sciences. We are a congressionally chartered, not-for-profit association of public-spirited citizens who seek to understand and improve our world through the study and discussion of vital societal issues. I can't think of one that is more vital or more timely today. So today with us, we've got four great panelists. Joshua Graham Lynn, who's the co-founder of Represent.us and the moderator. I'll give him a quick bio in a second. We have Admiral Steve Abbott, U.S. Navy retired, Carlos Cabello, a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and Amber McReynolds, CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute. Before I turn it over to Josh, I'll give him a quick intro. He is the co-founder and managing director of Represent.us, which is a movement of independents, progressives, and conservatives that pursues federal reform through action in the states. Represent.us seeks to pass powerful anti-corruption laws that stop political bribery, end secret money, and fix our broken elections. Since the organization's inception in 2012, Mr. Lynn has led the movement in brand building and helped build Represent.us into an 800,000 person strong political movement. Joshua, I would like to turn it over to you as well as the screen and let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Fred. Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here again with the National Institute. And, I just want to say first, I am so appreciative of everybody being able to take their time, especially these days. Things are more challenging than usual. And I hope everything is well with all of you and all of your loved ones. As Fred already said, we're here to talk about democracy, the election, the vote counting, the post office. We'll go beyond that. And as we all know, politics these days have become so much more polarized, more tribal, and as a result, much more dysfunctional than I believe any of us have seen in our lifetime, perhaps even since the Civil War. And we're learning kind of week on week how fragile some of these systems that we depend on really are. We've got this incredible panel of experts today to help us interrogate these questions about the safety, security, trustability of our elections. And they're going to share with you some exciting programs that some of us are working together on that'll be run to help protect that election, to protect the sanctity of our democracy. Panelists, I'm going to give you guys the option to turn off your video cameras for a few minutes if you would like, because I'm going to run through a 5 to 7 minute slide presentation here that just gives a little context on kind of how we got here, what brought us to this place. And the idea that I want everybody to take with it is that the systems that we have in place in our government today are actually incentivizing this party over country behavior, the polarization, the gridlock, and the corruption. So I'm going to share my screen, which is always super awkward on Zoom. You'll have to see my messy desktop for just a minute. Run you through a quick slideshow, and then we'll come back and I'll give the three other panelists the introduction they actually deserve. So here we go. We're going to start here with what I consider to be the vision of democracy of America that many of us carry, that we are this shining city on the hill, the beacon of democracy for the rest of the world to look to, as Reagan so beautifully put it. But these days, we see turmoil in the streets. In fact, federal officers in the streets. We're trying to run an election, relatively turbulently. There were some problems in many of the primaries. We see them pushing forward. This is a photo from Wisconsin during the primaries. And by and large, I would say this is one of the most severe problems that we're facing, and we're going to talk a lot about it today. This idea that both Republicans and Democrats, albeit for very different reasons, have serious doubts about the ability for the United States to have a free and fair election. More than half of us, in fact, from both sides, now doubt that things will be free and fair. But what I want to take into this, I said I was going to provide some context, is that these are actually symptoms of the system itself, because we are living through what I would call a system failure. The entire system is experiencing failure. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about the system failure for a few minutes to get us started, and then we're going to switch our minds into the 2020 election and how everything that's brought us till now is going to move going forward. So system failure. As I said before, we're losing trust. Only 2% of Americans trust that our elections work every time. 4% of us have a great deal of confidence in Congress. More than half say that political corruption is a crisis. A recent study from the Harvard Business Review found that there is virtually no correlation, and this is a direct quote, between serving the people and getting reelected into office. It follows on to a 2014 study from Princeton. They looked at 1,800 public opinion polls over 20 years and found that the preferences of the average American appear to have a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. And as I said, this is because inside this system, we have the wrong incentives. Politicians spend their time fundraising. Lobbyists end up writing our laws. We have a two-party anti-competitive duopoly. And what I mean by that is you get to vote Democrat, Republican, or feel like you're throwing away your vote, spoiling the election, as we often heard it called. This chart shows that by and large, the American people are leaving the major parties and wish they had other options. That's why we're seeing this trend towards independence, which, as you can see, is now going down in the Trump era as things become more polarized, more tribal. But by and large, it is this incentive for gridlock. It is the incentivization of extremism built into the system. Consider this. We gerrymander our voting districts. They are drawn by computer algorithm to cut out voters that vote against the party who won the last time around. As a result, 86% of House races are now uncompetitive. And when we talk about incentives, think about it this way. If the primaries are not, if the generals are not competitive, if the general election is not competitive, it means all of the competition is in the primaries, which pushes to the outside because the primary voters tend to be so much more polarized than the general electorate. And here's what happens as a result. This is the most important part. This chart shows the times that Congress reached across the aisle to pass a law in 1953. Each black line is a law that got passed for 1953 across the aisle. Here it is for 1967. Here it is for 1981. Look at 95, sorry. And here we are in 2011, which represents where we are today. We have incentivized division in the system by the way it's designed. And now I'm not going to get into the details here because we're here today to talk about the 2020 election. But what I want you to think about is how might we fix this? How do we fix it? And the answer lies here in a Bloomberg study. It takes about a minute to explain. It shows how passing state laws and changing state laws can lead to national victory and therefore change incentives. This is women's suffrage, laws getting passed in the states over time. When we reach the right side of the chart, that's when federal law happened. Here it is again for interracial marriage. You'll see there's a few states, we see progress as states pile up, and then on the right-hand side of the chart, interracial marriage becomes federal law. This time, watch that yellow line. The yellow line, you'll see right after it, there is an acceleration. This one's for marriage equality in just over a decade. That acceleration is critical here. It represents a key event, a court decision or a grassroots campaign reaching maturity that can trigger a rush of state activity that ultimately leads to a change in federal law. And so if we want to see change in federal law, if we want to be able to fix the system and fix the incentives, we need to replicate the success of what we've seen. And keep in mind, these other issues I showed you took centuries and decades. This is a long-term play, but we need to commit to it now. And so the way that works is passing laws that fix the system all across the country, bringing conservatives and progressives together to work on these laws. And this is the last point I'm going to make. This is a chart of how Americans self-identify politically, and it shows why it cannot just be conservatives or progressives fighting this fight. Because by and large, we are a moderate to conservative country. And in the past, these issues that control the incentives in our government have been fought for largely by progressives, with liberal messengers, liberal messages to liberal audiences, leaving behind this other 75% of the country that overwhelmingly supports these kinds of laws that fix the system. As you can see, massive support across party lines for laws that affect the way the system works to improve democracy. And if you think this is all just pie in the sky and impossible, let me tell you this. Since 2012, our movement, and this includes everybody on the call, not just my organization, has been responsible for more than 120 wins in states across the country to fix politics in red, blue, and purple states alike. In fact, since 2015, this is what the map looks like. You can see we've got vote by mail, voter registration, anti-gerrymandering, money in politics, ranked choice voting, ethics reform. All of these add up to changing the incentives. Here's where we're headed for 2020. And even beyond that, these are the places where it may be possible to pass full vote at home, which Amber will talk about a lot more later, in states across the country. Now, again, these are coalition maps, but you can learn more about them at represent.us/map. Now, I'm going to leave us there and ask our panelists to come back. And we will pick up the conversation after I give you guys the introductions that I feel like you so very much deserve. I want to turn off my screen sharing here, Fred. There we go. You can see everybody. Okay, first up. Amber, you're on screen first, so I'm going to talk about this. So Amber is one of the country's leading experts on election administration and policy, co-author of the book, When Women Vote. She is the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute Coalition and is the former director of elections for Denver, Colorado. Amber serves on the National Election Task Force on Election Crises. And wow, does that sound relevant today? Carlos Curbelo was in 2010 elected to represent his community on the Miami-Dade County School Board, and in 2014 was elected to Congress, where he served until January of 2019. In 2017, Curbelo was honored by the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation for his work promoting bipartisan cooperation on environmental policy. Today, Carlos leads Vocero and serves as an on-air analyst for NBC News, MSNBC, Telemundo, MSNBC6, and Telemundo 51. And last but not least, Admiral Steve Abbott, retired U.S. naval officer who served as the president and chief executive officer of the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, a private, not-for-profit aid society dedicated to assisting sailors, Marines, and their families until September 2019. From October 2001 to May 2003, Mr. Abbott served as the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to the President. As you can see, we have an incredible panel here with us today. And what I've done is I've asked all three of them to answer the same questions to kick us off. And we're going to keep this to just 30 seconds to a minute each, just to get us rolling. And here's what I've asked them. You've each served your country in different ways. And so I'd like you to tell us what inspired you to serve. What made you want to get started? And then I want to follow up that with 3 words that you chose, or phrases, that best describe the state of democracy and how it will affect people's lives. And I'm going to go to Amber first. Will you kick us off?
Sure. Well, I served as an elections official for 13 years and now serve in a nonprofit trying to help improve the voting experience across the country for every single elector, because I believe in leaving the world a better place than the way I found it. And part of that is I have 2 small children, and I want to be sure that they have a voting experience that's awesome when they get to that point. But I also believe, and I reformed an organization in a significant way in Denver when I started, that was a bad office and didn't do elections very well, and we set out to put voters first. And so my kind of professional mission is to put voters first. I think by redesigning our structures and systems, we can better serve voters more effectively while also increasing trust in the process, enhancing security, and also increasing engagement and turnout, because democracy is essential.
And what were your 3 words?
My 3 words. So For this year, in particular, uh, resiliency is a critical one for election administration. It has been going back to 2016. Having courage in the face of adversity, and election officials right now are facing that across the country. So every day I see more and more examples of how they're demonstrating courage. And then future. And the reason I chose future is, I think that we're all learning a lot of lessons right now with the pandemic, and we're going to have some really interesting conversations about what the future looks like for not only the election process, but really all dimensions of our lives that have been upended by this pandemic.
Absolutely. Carlos, I'm going to ask you the same questions. What inspired you to serve, and what are your 3 words about the state of democracy and how it'll affect our lives?
Thank you, Joshua. I was recruited to run for the school board by a group of friends and local activists. I turned them down the first time, and then they came back and convinced me. And I spent 4 years on the school board, and I had such a wonderful experience that it really cemented my belief in the fact that government can be a force for good in society, and that government can improve people's lives. So then an opportunity to run for Congress came up, and I didn't rush to run. I encouraged a couple other people to run, and they decided not to. So then I decided that I'd be the next best candidate. And I won, and I served 2 terms in the House, and was consistently ranked one of the most bipartisan members, which is something that I'm pleased with, even though it was a difficult time to serve. I feel like I did my part. The 3 words that come to mind in thinking about how people feel ahead of this election or about our democracy generally is fearful, angry, and insecure.
Wow. Steve, same questions. What inspired you to serve, and what are your 3 words?
I think my story is a little perhaps easier and less interesting. I was the son of a naval officer, and he was the son of a naval officer. And so I had, military service in my blood. They say I was born on the crest of a wave and rocked in the cradle of the deep. So I got to start serving when I was 17 and had a Navy career, and then realized that if you get to fly Navy jets, you really ought to be paying the taxpayer instead of the taxpayer paying you. And I had a wonderful time doing that, 38 years, and have just been looking for other things that I could do to pay back. I thought about the 3 words I should use, and I'm going to cheat a little bit. If you can let me say that ship of state is a 1 single word, I would say that my 3 words are ship of state listing badly.
Well, a real mix of hopefulness and also recognition of the very delicate state of affairs. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank all 3 of you for your service in the different ways you've done it. I'd like to start off not with maybe the darkest subjects that we will get to, but instead, Carlos, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who, as you just said, has really focused on working across the aisle. Can you tell everybody here what lessons you have learned from that work that you think could help guide us into the future? Because as Amber said, this looking to the future and the lessons that we may need to take with us are going to be so essential. And it sounds like you've done a lot of work in that way. So what can we learn from it?
Well, I just want to reiterate or support what you said in your presentation to kick us off here today. The system is designed to prevent people from working together, to make it difficult. I told someone recently, in the context of a conversation regarding a bipartisan proposal that was put together to find a compromise on additional COVID relief for the country, which we know Congress has been stuck on that for a few weeks. And some people were surprised that the leadership in both chambers was uninterested in that proposal. And I told them it's not just that they're uninterested. The leadership of both parties dedicates a lot of their resources every day to squashing the efforts of members who are reaching across the aisle to try to legislate. So we have a Congress that is made up of a lot of people who are really powerless in many ways. And look, everyone does their best, and most people who are serving in Congress are really well-intentioned, and they're really trying to do what's best for the country. It's just that the system really gets in their way. Mm-hmm. And whether it's because they have to fundraise or because they aren't allowed to introduce amendments at certain stops in the legislative process, or because they're discouraged or threatened by their leadership not to work with certain congressman or woman from the other party because that person's going to be targeted in the next election, and if you work with them, you're going to help them. Like you said, Josh, all of the incentives are misaligned, and we can't just tell people to act differently. I mean, we can, and I think people should, but the way our system is designed, people want to get reelected. Mm-hmm. And as long as getting reelected is the top priority, which it will likely remain the case for most people who are serving in public office, then it's just not going to work unless we change the system, the structures that are forcing people into these behaviors.
Thanks. Now, Steve, I want to ask you, I think, again, in the spirit of the bigger picture here, we talked with Carlos about working across the aisle. We spoke a little bit beforehand, and I asked you if perhaps you could provide a little historical context to the moment that we're in, because we're living in this pandemic. The United States Post Office is being threatened. The president is stating that he may not leave office. This is unlike anything that certainly I've ever seen. I'm only just a couple years younger than you, I think. But if you could provide context that might help us understand it, I think that would be really helpful.
I have a little trepidation about this question because I'm almost certain that Amber and Carlos know a whole lot more American history than I do, and certainly about elections and voting. But I stumbled on a discussion of the election of 1876, which is the election in which Rutherford B. Hayes defeated Tilden. Hayes, the Republican, had ended up on the day of the election with substantially fewer electoral votes. But there was an electoral commission engaged, which was set up to determine who was the winner, because no one had achieved the majority of electoral votes. And that commission continued all the way until March of the following year. And by the way, Tilden was within one electoral vote of winning immediately after the election. And by March of that year, the Electoral Commission had decided that Hayes was going to be the winner. And so there was a backroom deal forged in which there was an agreement that the federal troops, which had been in the South since the end of the Civil War and had enforced Reconstruction, would be withdrawn. And so that was the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the solid democratic South. And I would say, if you're trying to find a historical precedent for a disputed election which resulted in unfortunate consequences, I think that would be a good candidate.
So Amber, if you take that historical perspective and apply it to really and I know this is like an opinion question, but I want to start here and just say, do you view the moment that we're in as a crisis? And then I'm going to follow up with some questions specifically about the vote by mail part of it.
I do believe it's a crisis. And, you know, I tried to kind of shed a little bit of an optimistic view with some of my sort of 3 words, partly because every day is pretty dark from an elections official kind of perspective. But here's what I would say. I mean, the presentation that you gave about the politicization of really all aspects of government and everything else, you know, have been unaffiliated my entire career. I actually chose to run elections as an unaffiliated person and be completely politically independent, partly because I think that I was more effective in doing my job by staying out, completely out of the political fray. And I actually think election administration needs to be run that way. The United States is actually fairly unique with the infusion of partisan politics into the conduct of elections. And what I mean by that is, you know, we have 50 different states, 50 different state legislative bodies, and then over 9,000 different local election officials that run this process. Some are elected, some are not. And so it's an extremely decentralized system. And when you have that decentralization and you have the inconsistency of, you know, one voter in a state like Colorado is way more eligible to vote than you're a voter in Mississippi, that's tough. And so I think we're going to have a conversation about governance. The second thing I would say is that election administration must be free from partisan politics. In theory, it should be about who votes, not who wins. And yet, all of the 50 different state legislative bodies are selfish. Many of them are very selfish in the way that they approach policy change. And often, and I get this on both sides of the aisle, the question is, if we go to vote by mail or we expand this, will I win? Will I win next time? Mm-hmm. And so we've given politicians the power to basically set the rules of the game, even though they're the players of the game. And they've got a personal stake in the outcome of these elections. So we have to have a broad conversation about this, because I've never seen elections politicized in this way. Now the Postal Service has been politicized. Both 2 entities, in theory, should just exist to provide efficient and operationally sound procedures and processes for the American electorate. And yet they've both been politicized in an extreme way this year that has hurt confidence, hurt trust, and is going to, and frankly, is going to create long-term damage to the voting process in a big way.
This idea of politicization, I was going to talk about this a little later, but I feel like maybe it comes in right now. Carlos, I know you've been working on open primaries, and that is a great example of a kind of reform that could help reduce the politicization. I promise we'll come back to the vote by mail stuff. But I thought if you could talk a little bit about how that work is going, what incentives you hope to shift with it, and of course, how you perceive that might change things, again, for the future. And Amber, I really appreciated your hopeful outlook at the beginning. So let's talk about a better future through things like open primaries.
So here in my state, there's a constitutional ballot question to open up primaries for state offices. It would not include federal offices. That would have required an additional question, and the people funding this effort didn't have the resources to fund both. So in Florida, we will have an opportunity to include no party affiliated voters in our elections from beginning to end. And that's very exciting, because it will force candidates running for office in both parties to campaign to appeal to more voters, not just the minimum number of voters, which is what our current closed primary process yields. Now here in Florida, we're looking to open up our primaries. In other states, they're looking to adopt ranked choice voting. And I think that's an even better solution that is inclusive of everyone from beginning to end, and that forces all candidates to appeal or to reach out to the highest number of voters from beginning to end. And I think that's how we eventually end up getting a government that is more representative of the country and of districts and of states by including more people in the electoral process. So Catherine Murdoch, who's someone we all have probably heard of on this call, has made the point that political philanthropy is the most important kind of philanthropy right now, because everything else in a way depends on it. If we fix our political system, we can fix a lot of other challenges we have in our country. But if this continues deteriorating, we're just going to create more problems. And I say this from the perspective of someone who's the child of exiles, of people who had to leave their country because there was a breakdown in institutions and they were no longer felt safe or secure. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, the takeaway I'm getting is that there's the crisis of the moment, and then there are these structural reforms that can help us alleviate perhaps not only the path that gets us here, but that next time around, maybe the volume is turned down a little bit on it. I want to get a little bit to start getting at the elephant in the room, which is, for me, the vote counting situation. And Amber, I'm going to turn this to you to start. So as I mentioned earlier, and as I know everybody has been following in the news, there's been a lot of discussion, and I will say at the outset, it is inaccurate misrepresentations of vote by mail, otherwise known as lies. And yet this debate continues. So Amber, as one of the foremost experts in the country, a former Colorado election official, how can you really put to bed any questions about whether or not vote by mail is wrought with fraud?
Well, we have a lot of data and research over time that actually finds that to be false. And regardless of the evidence and the data that's been presented, there's still this narrative. And you know, it's problematic for the voters, for the voting process, for election officials. And you know, what I also think it demonstrates is a lack of understanding by the folks that are perpetuating the narrative about the actual process itself. And the reality is the general public doesn't understand election processes, what goes into the conduct of an election, how ballots are counted, how things are audited. But frankly, most politicians also don't understand it. Back in 2016, when this same narrative, by the way, was being perpetuated in Colorado during a speech by then candidate Trump, I actually tweeted at the campaign and I said, hey, reminder, our office sent you an invitation to come and tour the process. We would love to have you here. We would love you to come see, bring President Trump, candidate Trump at the time. We would love to show you this process. The local campaign had come, but the national had not. And I extended that invite actually twice because of the false narrative. No one ever came. And so I think that it shows, like, whether it be the Attorney General's comments or things like it is a complete lack of understanding of the process. And the reality is local officials are the ones that run this process around the country. There are very specific procedures and processes in every state. Yes, some states have handled more vote by mail ballots than others, but the reality is there has been a vote by mail program on the books in all 50 states going back to the Civil War, even at the time. So it's been here, it's been present. There are best practices, there are processes and procedures, and so it is a safe and secure method. And what I would caveat that with is it's also important that voters follow the instructions. If your state doesn't have a postmark deadline, meaning your ballot has to be received by election offices, you should drop it off if it's too late to mail the ballot back. So there is some responsibilities, just like there is with in-person voting, on the voters to complete the instructions correctly, fill out the ballot correctly, turn it in on time. And if you have any confidence issues about the post office processes 400 million pieces of mail a day. There's less than 200 million people in the country, and certainly probably close to maybe half will vote. Even if they all returned it on the same day, that's a blip to the United States Postal Service in terms of their scale and their operations. So there's just a lot of misinformation. It's clearly designed to hurt the process, create distrust, and that's just the fact. The final thing I would say is, just like in-person voting and the entire election process, we need to be able to deter, detect, and hold bad actors accountable if they are in fact trying to interfere with voters, trying to misinform voters, or trying to interfere with the process. And there's specific procedures and processes in place to do just that. And there's evidence that that's happened many times with different cases that have been filed and all of that. So So that's what I would say about it. Hopefully that gets to the
I love it.
question, and happy to answer more on it.
I think it does. I read somewhere that the post office processes something like 2 billion Christmas cards with a B, billion, versus the maybe 100 million votes could possibly be cast. But I want to actually move to Steve for just a second, because you brought up the Civil War. And I also know that the Civil War is when absentee balloting was started. And it was originally invented for the military. Now, as a veteran, I don't know if you have voted absentee, but I do want to ask you your feelings, your thoughts, any perspective on, we as a nation are choosing a commander-in-chief, and it is quite possible, as some people are threatening, that men and women in uniform, if they vote by mail, may have their vote threatened. What are your thoughts on that?
We have to prevent it from happening. So I'm going to differ a bit, perhaps, with Amber's perspective by saying that it's my view, and I believe it's the view of the leadership in the Department of Defense, that although active duty service members are required to be not overtly political, they are expected to discharge their civic duties by voting in elections, and we need to make it possible for them to do so. And we expect them to have opinions about what's going on in the country. And so it's not just the men and women who are overseas, although that's one of the challenges, is getting the votes to the 200,000 or so who might in fact be far from our shores. It's also getting them to vote wherever they happen to be. And I think that the Department of Defense actually does a pretty commendable job at getting the information out to our military members. And there are plenty of organizations, of which this is one, and Count Every Hero, which I hope we'll talk about a little more, is focused on helping make sure that that happens. I also understand, excuse me, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, go ahead and talk about Count Every Hero. Let everybody know, why that's so important right now.
Well, this is an effort in this election cycle to focus energy and effort on that very task of helping to ensure that military men and women, in fact, are able to receive the ballots that they need, and they know how to fill them out and get them back. But then Count Every Hero also has a focus, and it's one that's needed, on what I call the back end, which is ensuring that when that vote comes back to where it's going to be tallied, that in fact it gets tallied and gets tallied on time and gets counted in the result, and that the results of the election are not announced until all of those military member absentee ballots have in fact been properly accounted for. So Count Every Hero is off to a good start, and it's going to work tirelessly between not just now and the election, but now and forever, for however long it takes after the election to get that mission accomplished. Now, let me just make one point, which is, if you want to look for a silver lining for the COVID crisis, it's in fact going to propel this country into being able to vote better by mail. And it may be certainly messy this year by anybody's estimate, but it will benefit us in the long run.
Well, let's talk about that sort of permanent vote by mail, because I shared the map earlier showing where it may be possible. Amber, you've been at the forefront of this for as long as I've been doing any democracy work. And so, Amber, I'm going to go back to you, and then Carlos, I've got a sort of separate topic for you in just a minute. But Amber, can you say, what are the basic benefits of, as we call it, vote at home or permanent vote by mail, or all the different ways that it gets said? But what are the benefits? Why is it so important? And how does it improve outcomes in our election, which I think is so important here?
Sure. Well, when we kind of set out to do our reform in Colorado, now 7 years ago, What we were seeing was a couple of things. First, voters were opting in record numbers once they had the ability to
Can you tell everybody
get.
about the system in Colorado? Because I'm not sure
Yeah,
they even have the
yeah,
basics.
for sure. So prior to 2013, we were a no excuse permanent absentee state, meaning you could sign up once and get it for all future elections. And we saw a significant number of voters request to be on that list. And so by that point, we, over 80% of voters requesting to be on that list, we actually decided to automate the entire process. So basically the entire voter transaction. So we passed a law that was comprehensive. Starting at registration, we passed automatic registration. We modernized our voter registration deadlines and got rid of the antiquated precinct residency requirements that force voters to sign up 30 days prior, and enacted same-day registration. And then we automated the ballot process. So not only did we make the voter registration process more efficient, eliminate a lot of the government bureaucratic paperwork and all of that, we also then automated balloting, meaning if you're active and you're registered to vote and you haven't moved, and we check address updates every 2 weeks. If all those things are true, you're going to get a ballot automatically before every election. And then we also, uniquely compared to Oregon and Washington, decided to preserve the option to vote in person, but we decided to also modernize that. So we got rid of the antiquated polling places where you had to go on your assigned day to the one location, and we instead enacted vote centers, which are also new in Colorado. So now we're mailing a ballot to every elector. We also have vote centers open 2 weeks. Vote centers means you can go to any location during that 2-week period or on election day, register to vote in person if you need to. So you basically have all options in front of you as a voter. That saves costs. We find that people that vote at home and use that ballot that was mailed to them go farther down the ballot, so they're more informed. And we know this through a few different studies. We also saw down ballot races uptick in turnout by 5 to 7%, depending on the race. We saw more people complete judges. We saw also more people complete those really long ballot initiatives like constitutional amendments. And we saw a significant increase in unaffiliated voter turnout. So for the first time in Colorado's history in 2018, unaffiliateds were the largest segment of the electorate, and we had the highest turnout. So we brought independent voters into the process in a much different way than what had ever been done before. We also, after passing that reform, we passed our open primary law, we passed redistricting, all of that on the ballot after we had enfranchised the entire population and made this process more accessible and more available. And so the benefits to voting at home are significant. You can be a much more informed voter. And my favorite benefit, because I'm a single mom with a 7 and a 9-year-old, is that when my ballot comes, I get to vote with them. It takes us a few days because it's a 6-page ballot, but it takes us a long time to do it. But we sit down together, they read the issues to me, they ask me things like, what does governor do? What does mayor do? Tell me about this. And we have this whole civics process every single election. And so I'm creating lifelong voters that know what it means to vote on the ballot, know how that relates to their community. And that's, I think, one of the most important benefits of all.
That is fantastic. And so, Carlos, I'm going to put you on the spot, even though I know that you agree wholeheartedly with Amber, because you guys have worked together quite a bit. But I'm going to ask you to speak on behalf of the Republican Party. There's been so much traction around the resistance to vote by mail amongst Republican and conservative voters, especially because of what the president is saying. And yet there are still many who are on the other side of that. And so there's this split and division happening amongst Republicans on this issue and around the president. And I'm wondering if you can shed a little light on maybe why that's happening, how that's affecting this issue and others, and how that might be leading us into this coming election.
So for Florida Republicans, this whole sudden campaign to undermine mail voting was a big surprise. In Florida, it's Republicans who maybe 20 years ago started making the idea of voting by mail, it used to be called absentee voting, popular. And Republicans became very adept at it. They always had a big advantage over Democrats when it came to mail voting, and that was completely erased in the last primary election. So the irony is that what appear to be the president's efforts to discourage people from voting by mail or to introduce or sow doubts about the safety and security of voting by mail seems to have hurt Republicans in the state of Florida in the recent August election. So, voting by mail has been safe and common here for a long time. I have voted by mail in just about every election for the last decade or so. And it's just very unfortunate that anyone would try to discourage people from voting that way, because for a lot of people, it's the easiest and most convenient way of voting. As Amber said, it's a great opportunity to bring kids into the fold and show them what the whole process looks like. I remember when I was a kid and I would go vote with my mom, I didn't know what she was doing. I couldn't see high enough, and I was always very curious about it. But this has been unfortunate, and the president is now sending mixed messages, telling Floridians that it's good to vote by mail, but telling people in other states that it's not. It's just very messy and unfortunate.
Well, let me ask you, as Steve said, about the back end. Because I agree with you, it's probably very possible to get people bought in on the benefits, especially when we have amazing stories about how well it works. But so much of what people are concerned about right now is the thing I mentioned earlier, that folks on both sides believe that there will be fraud in the election. And as somebody who was an elected official, what would you say to your constituents right now in the heat of the moment to restore trust in the system? Because that lack of trust it's a vicious cycle, right? It's the right blames the left blames the right. It keeps getting worse. We keep distrusting. And next thing you know, we don't even believe in our democracy. So, as a Republican leader, as a conservative, as a member of Congress, what would you be saying to restore that trust?
So what I would be saying is what I'm saying. And Josh, one of the reasons I chose this cycle to stay completely out of partisan politics, I'm not publicly supporting any candidates or endorsing or even talking about who I'm going to vote for, because I'm committed entirely to my work on television, informing the public as to what is true and what is not. Anytime I get an opportunity, I remind Floridians and people all throughout the country that voting by mail is not only safe, it's something that the Republican Party has encouraged over many years here in our state, and that they shouldn't be fearful, that they should be confident in voting by mail. And it's as good as it's ever been in Florida, because now if your signature doesn't match the signature on file, they call you. Then they'll notify you with time, and you can actually go and get that corrected and make sure your ballot counts. In the past, people would find out after the election that their ballots may not have counted, and that was certainly problematic. And look, there's nothing wrong with people who like to go vote in person. That's some people are just like, hey, that's what I like to do. It's an event, great. But the point is that all of the options should be okay. And that's what I spend a lot of my time doing these days, reminding people of what is fact, what is fiction, what is true, and what is a one campaign or another's manipulation tactic.
That's great. Well, I wish we had more people still inside the system doing what you're doing and committing to facts and truth. We have about 10 minutes before the top of the hour, and I want to remind people you can use the Q&A button in the Zoom interface to ask your own questions, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. I've been saving this really kind of juicy, if you will, question for us to get to a little bit here. I figured people on the call could get some of the background and education from all of us before we got here. But I want to talk about an article that came out in The Atlantic yesterday. Bernie Sanders spoke about it today in a big speech. As many of you may have seen, the president is now on record for the second or third time saying that he is unlikely to concede the results of the election, and that what should probably happen is that all of these fraudulent ballots should just get tossed out so that he will win, and then he's happy to accept the results. And this is not me putting any spin on this at all. That is what was said. And so this article in The Atlantic, it details the possibility that millions of ballots could be ignored or outright pushed aside after the votes come in. And so there's this concept called the blue shift, where on election day, it will look as though Trump has the lead because the Republicans tend to be voting more in person. But as the mail-in ballots are counted, the results will shift blue because more and more of the Democratic votes will be counted. Now, this is a possibility. I don't know if it'll go this way. I don't know exactly who's voting in person, but it seems very plausible. And what I want to get at here is, given that blue shift possibility, you either have a president who's going to try to claim victory on election night, or you have a challenger who is going to challenge that result. And either way, that has the distinct possibility of leading to a constitutional crisis, where we don't have a clear winner and a clear loser. Nobody concedes the election, and democracy moves into effectively free fall. Now, I don't want to be an alarmist, but I am going to kick it to the three of you to start unpacking this. And I think, Carlos, since we were just on, I want to ask you, what would you ask of the American people today, right now, given this prospect, given this sort of unique mush of ideas that I just went through?
Look, I'll say the good news is that Mitch McConnell spoke out against this. Marco Rubio and others have spoken out against this. I know a lot of people have been frustrated with Republicans in office because they've had a very high tolerance for some of the president's most irresponsible or provocative comments. And it seems like there is a red line, and it's good to know that at least that red line means that we have a peaceful transitions and that we recognize election results in this country. But look, this is personal to me because, again, I come from a family whose country lost their democracy and where elections were preempted. There was massive fraud, real fraud, and government-sponsored fraud. And of course, we see this all over the Americas, in Venezuela and other countries. And it's because of those ills that so many people have come to the United States to seek refuge and stability and honesty and integrity and institutions that protect people. And when these statements are made, they undermine all of that. And that's why I chose as one of my words insecure, because I think a lot of people, well, many people are still feeling tribal about this election. Most people are. I think there are a lot of people who feel disenfranchised and feel like this political system no longer represents them, recognizes them, and actually excludes them. I spoke to a reporter today, said, have these Republicans said enough? And I said, we cannot be outspoken enough about free and fair elections and about peaceful transitions of power. We cannot be outspoken enough about those founding principles.
I really appreciate that. One detail that I didn't get into in my kind of messy overview a moment ago was that I believe in Pennsylvania, there are legislators who amongst the states have suggested that they are already having talks about what to do if it appears that there is widespread fraud in the vote by mail system. And as part of that, that kind of comes back to what, Steve, we were talking about before. As part of that, that would be military votes that are then uncounted if Pennsylvania or any other state decides to push the election choosing to the legislature rather than using the popular vote to encourage their electors. Now, if that scenario were to happen, what would you assume the military response would be? And can you talk about how Count Every Hero is reacting and responding to this scenario right now?
I don't think I'm going to start out by answering the question directly because I think I'd like to work down to it. And it's going to emphasize some of the things that Carlos and Amber have already said, because what we're talking about here really are three bedrock principles of this democracy, which is every citizen must have the right to vote. And the second thing is that those votes must be counted. And then the third thing is we all have the right that the count will be respected. And so that's what we're getting at, I think, in a sense, is we need to do those first two parts right, but then also carefully attend to that issue of making sure that they're properly counted. So a lot of people have been talking about, well, what are the powers of the various, elements of government, especially, the president and his very substantial powers as the commander in chief, and the Department of Defense and our active duty military forces, but also the National Guard and their role, and the fact that the governors are, in fact, in every sense, commander-in-chiefs of their state, and mayors are commanders-in-chief of their cities. And so those powers have to be dealt with properly in order to avoid the constitutional conflict that you're talking about. At the same, and by the way, the broad powers that we give, in my view, are necessary and appropriate. We have circumstances where we need the executive to be able to act promptly in defense of this country, and that's built into the system. But we also have to ensure that power is not abused. And in all these cases, we have to make sure that the president and the governors and the mayors are preserving the right, if it were to come to this, and this is going to build on something that Carlos said, for people to protest about something with which they disagree, which may include the election. And if it's necessary to use force, then there have to be agreements about how that's going to be affected. And it's not just some theoretical possibility, it's a real possibility. And we must ensure that if there are vigilante efforts following the election, that the constituted officials have the planning done to be able to deal with it. Now, there is a lot of discussion about the Insurrection Act and whether that gives the president the power that he might use federal forces to intervene. And that's a pretty complex question, and I don't propose to try to give the history lesson that Carlos could do better than I could on it, but it's constrained, as we know, by posse comitatus, which actually was in about the same time as that election we were talking about between Hayes and Tilden. And it was meant to prevent the misuse of federal forces in maintaining order. And so what we have now is the situation where it is true that there could be an effort by the executive to use military forces, but it has to be seen in a context of what they would be used for. One of the interesting statistics that you should keep in mind is that 43% of the active duty force are minority. And if the executive is going to begin to use the active duty force in a way that works to the detriment of those minority, that will be a very difficult circumstance for the military leadership. So there needs to be space made after the election occurs for the count to be made and for the count to get through the processes that you all know better than I do. And that space needs to be ensured, in my view, by what Carlos talked about, which is people speaking out. because that's what will ensure that indeed the election progresses properly to a conclusion that we can accept. And that means that we should all be speaking out. And if I can get back to the count every hero message, it is, we got to all be voting, and we ought to, especially this time, try to be voting early. And then all of us have got to insist that those votes are counted.
Amber, I'm going to ask you to pick up right there with the final word on this topic, and then I've got some great questions in the Q&A for you guys. The last thing I'd like to ask of you is, in terms of speaking out, I think the question on all of our minds is, to whom and what do we say? Where are the points at which we, regular Americans of any ilk, have leverage in this particular scenario?
Well, I think first and foremost, taking the partisanship out of it. So I do think that experts that have run elections before, experts that are nonpartisan in the way that we talk about this as a process, as an operation, as a technical procedure is really, really important. And local officials are the trusted sources. They're the ones that are counting ballots, processing ballots, all of that. State officials oversee policies and regulations, but they're actually not the ones that are tallying votes for the most part, with the exception of one state. So local officials are critical, honestly, in the voices, and they don't have massive Twitter followings. They're not celebrities. They don't get their word out, and they don't have communications budgets, which is why we've been trying to help support that. And then the other point I would just make here, and just thinking about this in sheer numbers, if we look at 2016, the most highly anticipated, highly watched, highest turnout election on record that we had at the time, 100 million eligible and registered voters, unless they missed the deadline, did not vote. So when we look at the winner and the candidate that didn't lose, they each got slightly over a quarter of all eligible votes, 60 some million for each one, and 100 million people faced barriers, didn't vote, couldn't get off work, couldn't wait in a 5-hour line, whatever it might be. That was 2016. So when we talk about and think about why people don't trust the process, of course they don't trust the process. They've waited in 7-hour lines. They're not sure if their ballot made it on time because there wasn't a ballot tracking system. So we've got to do a better job of delivering elections, getting the policies right, removing the barriers, and giving every voter an opportunity regardless of their circumstances. And then finally, like the election problems that we see, long lines, Florida 2000, the backlogs in voter registration, any administrative issues that we're seeing today are due to two things: poor policies and a lack of funding. Both of those two things are the responsibility of policymakers on both sides of the aisle. And Congress failed election offices in a massive way this year in the CARES Act by allocating $400 million to 9,000 different local entities, 50 states. And when you compare that to what they gave the airline industry, it's almost unfathomable that they would do what they did. And that's $60 billion to the airline industry and 400 million to 200 million Americans, 9,000 election offices in 50 states. That's why we've got these controversies. That's why election offices are struggling, because they don't have the proper funding, and they never have.
Thank you for that. You touched on something that's in one of the Q&As here. So I'm going to put up your hand if you want to answer this one. It says, question: Bush v. Gore depended upon counting and recounting the paper ballots. Ultimately, we had the hanging Chad incident as a follow-up. The question is, what is the likelihood that the mail-in ballots this time around, because not everybody is doing it the way Colorado does, what is the likelihood that the mail-in ballots lead to a hanging Chad situation, where it's about signature matching, or, you know, was it in the right envelope, et cetera?
So
Well,
there's definitely we're going to see some issues like that for sure. Yeah. But it's not going to be the same. It's a very different kind of scenario. Florida 2000 was about voter intent. And if we remember, after all of that happened, that was the last time Congress put a lot of money into the election process. And their immediate overreaction was, let's throw hundreds of millions of dollars at building technology that ended up being insecure, and that's all been scrapped. And here we are back again with a different version of paper ballots. So it's not going to be the same. It's a little bit different scenario, but there will be controversies, and it might not be mail-in ballots. Provisional ballots are going to be the highest number that we've ever seen. Florida 2000 didn't have provisional ballots as part of it. That came after. And so provisional ballots are the final ballots to be counted. They're often the most controversial, and there will be a record number cast this year because of voter registration issues and all those other things that happen.
Carlos, it looked like you wanted to add something, and can you start by defining provisional ballot? You may not know.
Sure. So a provisional ballot is, let's say someone shows up to a polling place and doesn't have their ID, and maybe their name doesn't appear in the roll. There was perhaps a mistake. So that person is allowed to cast a ballot, but that ballot will not definitely be counted or not. For example, if they can then show that that person voted by mail and maybe forgot, or, you know, obviously that second ballot or that provisional ballot would not be counted, or if the person is not registered to vote or is not a citizen, whatever the case may be, then that ballot is not counted. But they do have to be taken on a case-by-case basis, which is laborious and can lead to a lot of controversy. And then I was going to just say pretty much what Amber said. Sitting here in South Florida, where we witnessed the hanging chads firsthand, we won't have those problems. Our ballots today are designed in a much better way, and it's much easier to ascertain what a voter intended to do. So yeah, we may have other challenges, but we won't have that challenge. And something we do in Florida, which other states I think should probably learn from, and then we have a lot of experience processing mail ballots, is that we get all those ballots counted before Election Day. And of course, the ones that come in on Election Day get counted too. And the first result that gets posted here in Florida is mail ballots. So that goes a long way to preventing any doubting or controversies about the election result.
That's great. While I've got you, there's another Florida related question here. I think people, either we all have winter and summer homes in different places, or they've got that there's a Florida specialist in the house. And this is a really amazing topic led by Desmond Meade, one of all of our friends. The question is about restoring the voter rights of former felons. And this has become an interesting topic for anybody on the call that doesn't know. The restoration rights in Florida was the largest addition of voting rights, I believe, in American history, with about 1.4 million former felons receiving back their right to vote that they had lost with their conviction. This is very recent, still developing. Carlos, can you talk about that? And the question is, how have local discussions gone in Florida, Colorado, elsewhere about the restoration of felon rights as pertains to voting?
Yeah, so in 2018, that ballot question passed with over 60% support, which is the threshold here in Florida. And I was actually the only Republican in the congressional delegation that supported Amendment 4 publicly and campaigned for it. And the reason I did that is, well, as we've all expressed here, because I believe in including as many people as possible in the democratic process, right? So the status of that is that ex-felons can have their rights restored, but the Florida legislature put up what many call an obstacle to that by saying that first they had to pay off any outstanding debts or fines to the court, and obviously for a lot of these people that's very difficult or impossible. So there's an effort now, and Mayor Bloomberg is involved, and there are other funders to try to help people, provide funding for people to pay off these outstanding debts and fines. This was a very close decision by federal appellate court in Atlanta. I think it was a 6-4 decision, where they said that Florida's, this requirement that the debts be paid off in order for these individuals to be able to vote, and that it was consistent with Florida's Constitution. So some of those individuals will be participating in this upcoming election, but probably many won't, unfortunately.
Yeah, my understanding is that they're actually very close to the fundraising goal that was set to make sure that the 700 or so thousand who were left over will have their bills paid, which is it's really fantastic. I'm going to ask each of you one final question. We're going to end on a positive note, despite our best intentions here. And that question is, what today gives you hope? And we'll go Steve, Carlos, and Amber. We'll let you have the last word before I kick it back to Fred.
I'm sorry, Josh, I didn't hear what the question was.
Well, then we're going to skip you. No, I'm kidding. The question is, what gives you hope today?
What did I hope?
No, what gives you hope?
Oh, what gives me hope? Okay. Well, this wonderful democracy of ours has a terrific track record for fixing problems since its inception. And Lord knows there were plenty of problems at the founding of this country. And, you know, wise men and women and an electorate that understood and cared, worked through them. And we have, in my view, the most wonderful democracy that has ever existed on the planet. But it won't stay that way unless we tend to it. And all of the things that have been discussed here, I think, are the things that give me hope. I would mention the things that you had in your own upfront presentation about how to deal with some of the distortions that have grown up over the time in our system. And we do see progress that Amber described in resolving those. And yes, in Florida, you know, felons who have paid their dues are receiving the vote. So there are positive things that I think, in fact, can give us hope. I would just come back to the nautical analogy that I had, which is, yes, I think the ship is listing, and there's a torpedo in the water, frankly, with this issue about the contested election. But I think we can get all hands on deck and maneuver the ship, and we can come out of this just fine. But it's going to take the steps that have been talked about and getting everybody to speak up, and before the election takes place.
Carlos, what gives you hope?
The rising generations in this country. In my in-person encounters with a lot of younger people over the years, and in a lot of the data I see from polling, I think rising generations have a far more sober perspective on politics, a far more inclusive vision for what our government and our politics should be. And I think that as these younger people start to populate Congress and state legislatures and other government bodies throughout our country, that things will start improving. Now, that doesn't mean we just sit around and wait for this great young hope to come of age. We have to do our part, and that goes back to a lot of the structural reforms that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. And I'm certainly committed to those for as long as it takes to get them done. And like you said, because of our federalist system, a lot of this requires us to go state by state, and it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of resources, but it's worth it. This country is the last great hope for many families, certainly for mine. So we want to preserve it, and we want to strengthen it for the future.
Excellent. And I see a special request here. Fred, you have a question for Amber. Let me answer Angela's question first. I see the question here. How do we help with the bill playing? It's FloridaRRC.org, the Florida Restoration Rights Coalition, FloridaRRC.org, and I know they would love the support. Fred, go ahead.
That's great. Yeah, Amber, I know that when we had our earlier planning session, you mentioned in the course of the discussion that, if I recall correctly, no federal election has ever been certified on the day or the night of the election. And I think, from what we're seeing in the press, and a lot of the worries are that the media is very prone to calling elections early. They have all kinds of sophisticated statistical methods that they feel comfort in doing so, but isn't it in fact the case that that is going to be highly counterproductive in this particular cycle, number one? And number two, more importantly, what can we do about it, and what is being done about trying to prevent the media from calling this too soon and making the situation worse?
That's a great question. So yes, we've never had a certified election on election night. So that's a myth and a falsity that's being perpetuated. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But being someone that lives in the western side of the country, this has been a frustration of Western voters for a long period of time, because this desire to start calling Eastern swing states by the 10 o'clock news on the East Coast, when Western voters are still in line voting, Hawaii and Alaska still have 4 or 5 hours left to vote, has been highly destructive, frankly, to many Americans that are still actually voting, and the bulk of the country in terms of population. So it's been a problem, and I think this idea that there's somehow this calling of a race when there's still military ballots to count, there's still a process to go through, there's still audits that happen post-election that a lot of people forget about. There's a canvas. It's just like any other accounting mechanism that we have. We need to account for everything that happens and be sure that every vote is counted and every voice is heard. And that is critical. One idea I have is, I think if Twitter got shut down for a few weeks and soon, that'd be great. I think that educating the national networks about this and ensuring that when they are talking about the election, number one, they have folks on that have been elections officials before, have run elections, that can provide that detailed context as to the differences by state, because there are many. But I think educating the media generally about this, and then getting them, when they are going to, put up a result, being very clear about what that result includes. So our mail ballots, like in Florida, being processed in advance. So when you get your Florida result, most of the mail ballots are going to be in that first report. Just like in Colorado, just like in states like Virginia, there's a lot of states where ballots are processed in advance. They're going to be in that first file. And in a state like Colorado, we tend to see 65 to 70% of all votes cast in that first report at 7 o'clock. And Florida is going to have the bulk of their mail ballots in that first report. So being able to provide that education of the media, how to report this, and also encouraging them to have experts that can talk about this in a sophisticated way and have that context by state is really, really important for this cycle.
That's great. Thank you. There are other very strong arguments for shutting down Twitter for several weeks as well, but I'm glad you've added to them. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I would just like to offer one final, very brief word, and then Fred, I'm sure you have a couple other thoughts as well after this incredible discussion. For me, it boils down to this, for everybody watching. What you heard over and over again is true. Democracy rests in your hands and in my hands and in our hands. And if we don't step up to protect it actively, it will not be there for our children. I think it's very prescient that that's how Amber started us off. We have this saying at Represent Us that I'm going to repeat here, which is that if you do nothing, you can be absolutely sure that nothing is going to change. But if you do something, and if each of us does something, we've got a shot at making things better together. And I just want to leave you with that. And thank you for your time.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you, Amber and Carlos and Steve. This has been an outstanding session. I think we've learned, all of us, a great deal. I certainly have. Really appreciate you making the time and helping inform us. This is exactly the kind of information our audience wants to hear. And I already know some people have scurried off to do things and already begun to put into play some of the activities you're recommending. And so I hope we can continue that going forward. But again, thank you all very much for doing that. What I'm going to do now is just switch over to the final and let everyone go. Again, thank you all for coming and attending today. We will continue to have virtual forums like this going on in the future, and encourage you to come to our website, sign up for our mailing list to learn more about this and to get more exciting and informative shows like this in the future. But again, thank you all very much for coming, and I wish you all to stay safe and healthy, and go vote.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, Josh.
Bye-bye.